All right, hello class. Welcome to your first videotaped lecture. Thank you so much for joining me, and please don't hesitate to ask me any questions about any of the material I covered today. Okay, so what we're doing today is we're laying the framework for our first unit of Econ 250, which is going to be focused on consumer theory. What I mean by consumer theory is essentially trying to understand in a formal and careful way how people go about getting the things that they want, given the resources that they have. In other words, when you have choices, when you have some set of resources, like a grocery budget, and you have a bunch of preferences, right? You like some groceries, you don't like others. How do you go about making that choice? And after we think about how an individual makes that choice, we're going to extend our analysis by thinking about the implications of a bunch of different people making similar choices. So we'll be able to answer questions like, if the price of wheat goes up, how's that going to affect the amount of wheat people buy? How's that going to affect the amount of rice people buy? If the price of housing goes up, is that going to improve consumer welfare or hurt consumer welfare? Does it depend on whether someone's an owner or a buyer? When incomes increase or decrease, how does that affect the fraction of a person's wealth that gets spent on healthcare and education versus food and housing? Now, the way that we're going to do that, as we talked about in our first lecture, right, we're not going to do this by trying to paint every detail of the real world. Instead, we're going to tell a simple and clear story that allows us to draw stronger conclusions. We're going to construct a parable. So we're going to ignore things that you might get in a psychology class about consumer theory, like how does having peppy music when you're in the grocery store affect your purchasing decisions? Or how do people's decisions depend on whether they're hungry or whether they're not hungry when they're making those decisions? We're going to leave all that aside, and instead we're just going to assume that people choose whatever they like best out of the options available to them. So what we're going to do in today's lecture is first we're going to formalize that idea, the idea that people choose whatever's best. And then we're going to work our way through how to draw conclusions from that assumption and how we build a mathematical structure around that assumption. So to start with, right, when I say people choose what's best, I want to be a little bit clearer about this. In other words, I'm going to define preferences. I'm essentially going to say that I prefer one thing, thing A to thing B. If given the choice, I would pick thing A over thing B. So let's say that I was offered either a Captain America Frisbee or a pigeon mask, right? If I chose the pigeon mask, I would say that I prefer the pigeon mask to the Frisbee, right? So I would say the mask is preferred by me to the Frisbee, where this means preferred. So we're going to indicate preferred with this weird squiggly greater than or equal to sign. The reason that it looks like a greater than or equal to sign, I know that I must like the mask at least as much as the Frisbee or I wouldn't have picked it. And why is it squiggly? Because I want to indicate here that this is my subjective preference, right? It's not that the mask is better than the Captain American Frisbee in general. It's just that that's what I would pick, given the choice. Okay, now the first thing I want to say, right? The way that we're gonna formalize preferences and be able to say that given any set of options, I'll choose what's best, is by making two further assumptions, which I'm going to call the assumptions of rationality. And these are really just two things necessary in order to say that I'll always choose what's best for me out of my choices. So the first thing is that I always have to be able to make a choice, which I'll formalize by saying that my preferences have to be complete. So this just means I either like thing 1 better than thing 2, or I like thing 2 better than thing A, right? If you give me a choice between A and B, between Frisbee and pigeon mask, I'll either pick one or I'll pick the other. The second assumption is going to be that my choices can't contradict each other. In other words, if I know some of my choices, my other choices have to follow through. And I'll call this transitivity. Choices can't contradict. So what this means is if I prefer the pigeon mask to the Frisbee, let's say that in addition, I prefer the Frisbee to some third choice, right? Like this rat painting, right? So I prefer the mask to the Frisbee. I prefer the Frisbee to the rat painting. In that case, it has to be the case that I would prefer the mask to the rat painting as well. And why is that? Why does this have to be the case? Because otherwise, if you gave me all three, I'd never be able to make a choice. Right? You offer me the Frisbee or the rat, I'll take the Frisbee. Or sorry, you offer me the mask or the Frisbee, I'll take the mask. Then you say, okay, well, how about the mask? The mask versus the rat. Let's say if I preferred the rat to the mask. Right? Then I'd say, okay, I'll take the mask over the Frisbee, but then I'll take the rat over the mask, and then I'll take the Frisbee over the rat. Right? I'll just circle the drain forever, and I'll never be able to come to a choice out of my three options. Okay. So essentially what these two mean together is that given a set of options, I'm always able to identify my favorite and pick my favorite, right? I can judge each of the two options against each other, and all of my choices are consistent. Awesome. Okay, so this is all it takes in order for us to say that you're able to choose what's best. But when we're talking, instead of about discrete things, right, like choosing the Frisbee versus the mask, if we want to think about continuous things, we want to think about things like, over the course of a year, how much of your time are you going to spend in leisure and how much of your time are you going to spend working? Or how many miles away from the city center are you going to choose to live? How much peanut butter and how much jelly do you buy when you go to the grocery store? We're going to add a couple of other assumptions. And these are not going to be made because they're necessary. They're not going to be made because they're true. They're going to be made because they're convenient. I'm going to call preferences that satisfy these two assumptions well-behaved preferences. So preferences to be well-behaved, they need to be rational, and they need two additional things. So the first is, if I like something, then I should always prefer more of it to less of it. I'll call this more is better. Right, so if I like donuts, you give me an extra donut, I should be happy. Now, is this always true in the real world? Well, no, not really, right? I do like donuts, but if I've had 36 donuts today, I might not want a 37th donut, right? That might actually make me feel worse, even though in general I like donuts. The reason that's not such a big problem, the reason we're able to make this assumption of convenience and mostly get away with it, is because when people have to give something up to get stuff that they like, they're not gonna have so much of the stuff that they like that they're actively unhappy getting another donut. Right? In other words, if I'm walking down the street and someone offers me a free donut, it's usually going to make me happier. And that's true of most people most of the time. The second is that diversity is better. What we mean by this is that the more of one thing that I have, the less of other stuff I'm willing to give up to get more. So, how much am I willing to pay for my first cup of coffee in the morning? It's going to be a lot more than what I'm willing to pay for my 8th cup of coffee in the morning. Right? The more of it I have, the less I'm willing to give up other things that I care about. Right? If I'm making a sandwich, I've got peanut butter and I've got jelly. The more peanut butter is already on the sandwich, the less jelly I'm willing to give up to get a little bit more peanut butter. Again, is this always true? No, it's not always true. Right? If I'm choosing between two TV shows, maybe as I start watching more, I get more and more into it, and I'm more and more willing to give up episodes of the other to get the first. Right? If I'm deciding what college to go to, I might be less willing to give up Oxy course credits for Claremont McKenna course credits, the more Oxy credits I get. Right? It's more convenient to just stay at the same place. But in cases where diversity isn't better, right, where I really want all one or all the other, I'm making a sandwich and I'm deciding whether to put herring or chocolate on it, right? I don't make the decision how much herring and how much chocolate. I make the decision, do I have a herring sandwich or do I have a chocolate sandwich, right? Do I go to Claremont McKenna? Do I go to Occidental College? And so in the kind of decisions that we're going to analyze, diversity is better is usually going to be a reasonable assumption. Okay, so this is what I'm going to say about preferences and preference relations. What we're going to do in the next video is we're going to think about how to show this graphically in cases where we're deciding how much of something that we want.